Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my November wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of November. Now, I read quite a lot in November. As you may have seen from my end of the year TBR video a couple of weeks ago, I had ambitious plans of what I wanted to read by the end of the year. I am not halfway through that TBR, but I did read 18 things in November, so that's not bad. So let me start off with some classics. In November, I read 2 of Charles Dickens' Christmas novellas. I'm currently hosting a Christmas Dickens read-along where we're reading Charles Dickens' 5 Christmas novellas in publication order. So the 2 that we read in November were A Christmas Carol and The Chimes. A Christmas Carol was first published in December 1843. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Hugh Grant, which was really, really great. And then The Chimes, which was first published in December 1844. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Richard Armitage. Another really great audiobook. I've made individual reflections videos for both A Christmas Carol and The Chimes, so I won't go on for too long about them here. In general, I just love A Christmas Carol so much. It is such a wonderful, heartwarming, enjoyable story of a selfish, unhappy, unkind man being visited by many ghosts who teach him the error of his ways and teach him to be both a better and a happier person, and I just love it. It's so festive and delightful, and I know it so well. I've read it so many times. It's always a joy to read. And then The Chimes is a story of a man called Toby who lives in grueling poverty and is beginning to despair of the world and despair of himself and others around him, to begin to have no hope in anyone, to believe that people from his class are all bad and born bad. And then the goblins of the Chimes at a local church show him visions of a possible future for the people around him, to show him how wrong he is. The Chimes is a really powerful, interesting story. It's quite confusing, and I don't think it's as effective as The Christmas Carol, but I do think it's really interesting. So if you have any interest in The Chimes, do go and watch my long, lengthy ramble about it, which I'll link down below. Then I also finally finished off reading The Lifted Veil, women's 19th century short stories. I've had this collection on my TBR for ages. I've been currently reading it for ages, but I finally finished off reading all the stories in this collection. Overall, I would say it's a bit of a mixed collection. Like, it's a bit of a mixed bag of stories. There were some great stories in here, but there are also some stories that are quite mediocre, and I kind of feel like the editors went for like big name authors and tried to find short things they'd written rather than looking for great short story writers who were writing in the 19th century. So for example, like there's a piece of Charlotte Bronte's Juvenilia, The Green Dwarf, which I just don't think is very good, and I feel like they wanted to include something by a Bronte sister, so they put it in. But actually, there's a lot of other women writers in the 19th century who were less well known, who were writing much better short fiction. And like, they include The Watsons by Jane Austen, which I absolutely love. Wonderful, wonderful fragment, but that's not a short story, that's an unfinished novel. I think the strongest stories in here were stories I had read before. So The Grey Woman by Elizabeth Gaskell, A Pair of Silk Stockings by Kate Chopin, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But there were a couple of new stories to me that I did think were really strong, especially Souls Belated by Edith Wharton, which I thought was fantastic. Glad that I finally got around to finishing this off. I think it's a very beautiful book and I'm glad to have it, but the stories within it were a bit of a mix. Moving into the 20th century, this month I reread Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. I didn't actually read this physical edition, but it is quite a nice old one from the 60s. But I actually listened to this on audiobook. Nick and I listened to this together. We have been working our way through the Poirot books in publication order, but we thought we would try some Miss Marple this time. I had read Murder at the Vicarage before, Nick hadn't. This is an Agatha Christie novel from 1930. It's the first Miss Marple, and as you might be able to guess from the title, someone is killed in the vicarage. Not someone who lives in the vicarage, but someone who was calling on the vicarage is found dead in the vicar's study, and we are following the vicar and various other people as they kind of try and work out what happened. And meanwhile, the vicar's nosy neighbour, Miss Marple, keeps getting involved. I do really like The Murder at the Vicarage. I think it is good fun, really engaging, lots of great characters, as always with Agatha Christie. I don't think it's one of her best, and in general, I think so far I prefer the Poirot novels to the Miss Marple novels, although Murder is Announced is a really, really good Miss Marple. I feel like this didn't hold up so well on a reread as quite a few of the Poirots do. although I do think that wasn't helped by the audiobook. We listened to the audiobook narrated by Richard E. Grant, and it was okay, but it wasn't like the best acted, I would say. And I feel like a lot of the Poirot audiobooks we've been listening to have been narrated by Hugh Fraser, who was just fantastic. So I feel like the audiobook quality was just a bit less good with this one, which probably didn't help, but there we go. Then I also read a Nigerian modern classic this month. This is No Longer at Ease by Chinua Achebe. This is a novel from 1960 set in the kind of late 1950s, I guess, about a young man called Obi who's come back to Nigeria after several years studying in Europe. He joins the Nigerian civil service, and he is really against the kind of corruption and bribery that he sees often within the civil service, and he wants to try and fight against that. But we know from the very beginning of the book that several months later, further down the line, he will be arrested for bribery, and we're kind of following how his life descends to get him to that point. I just thought this was really, really fantastic. This is the second book in a loose trilogy, and I read the first one, Things Fall Apart, like a decade ago, and I don't remember getting that much out of it or finding it that interesting, but this I thought was fantastic. Maybe I should reread Things Fall Apart because it has been a very, very long time since I read it, but I just thought this was really, really well done. The characterization was so excellent, and the sort of slow shift in Obi's life was really well drawn, and I just thought it was a really, really great book, so very much worth your time. I found this really, really interesting. Then I also read a classic from the Philippines. This is The Woman Who Had Two Navels and Tales of the Tropical Gothic by Nick Joaquin. So this is a really interesting anthology collection. There's quite a lot of different things in this book, in this edition. So there are a bunch of short stories, some very short, some very long, and there is also a play. And I have such mixed feelings about this book as a physical book because basically I didn't massively get on with the short stories. Some of them I did find quite interesting. I think my favourite of the short stories was Guardia de Honor, which I did find quite interesting, and has a really strange time slip supernatural element that was quite effective. In general, the short stories kind of blend realism and sort of surreal stuff in a way that was quite interesting, but I'm not sure I always got. And there were quite a few of the short stories that I didn't really get on with, and that I felt like I was just missing something or didn't quite get them. But then the last thing in this book is a play, and the play is a portrait of the artist that's Filipino, and the play was amazing, like one of my favourite plays I've ever read, absolutely fantastic, 5-star, like one of my favourite classics of the year. The short stories I was not that fussed by, but the play was amazing, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book, but I would hugely recommend A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino by Nick Joaquin, because I thought that was fantastic. So the play is about these two sisters in their early 40s. They're living in this house with their father who's not well. They can't really afford to keep up this big house anymore. They're struggling for money, and the only thing they own of value is this painting that their father painted called A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino. Some people think it's beautiful, some people think it's hideous. The idea is that it's like on the wall that is facing the audience, so the audience watching the play never see the painting, they're just told about the painting, and they see lots of people looking at the painting, but they're actually looking at the audience, if that makes sense, which is a very fun idea. And we're following what happens with this family and their financial situation and the painting. This is also set in like 1941, so World War II is happening, but it hasn't come to the Philippines yet, but they all know that a war is coming, and so there's a sense of like dread over the course of the play, and it's just fantastic. Like if you like Chekhov and that kind of like hopeless but fantastic kind of play, then I think you will really like A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino. I thought it was so good. Don't know how I feel about the short stories, but so glad I kept on and read the whole thing because the play was amazing. I think probably that play was my favourite thing I read this month, so there we go. Then this month I also read The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, and this is the second book in a series of classic children's books from the 1960s, 1970s. I thought this was really, really great. So it's the second book, but we're following different characters from the first book. There are some recurring characters and a recurring kind of antagonist force, I guess, but it's quite a sort of separate story. This book is set over the Christmas period, and we follow a young 11-year-old boy called Will, whose world starts to crumble when strange things occur, and he wakes up one day shortly before Christmas to find that the world around him is changing and that he has slipped back into the past. And throughout the book, he kind of splits between the past and present as the dark forces of evil try to rise. And it's just really, really well done. It's a great narrative. Will is such a great character. I love the premise and the kind of use of like history throughout it. And it's just really, really well done. I really, really recommend Susan Cooper. She's a great writer, and I'm really looking forward to carrying on with the series. Moving away from classics, and now we get into some contemporary novels. One other thing I read this month was This Is Amako Do You Copy by Natsuko Imamura, translated from the Japanese by Hitomi Yoshio. So this is a short Japanese novel about a young girl called Amako. It's a coming of age story, and we're following Amako, who is struggling to kind of understand all the various different circumstances that are going on in her family. And I just thought it was really, really well done. It reminded me a little bit of Masai Sandwich by Meiko Kawakami, which is one of my favourite Japanese books. And I just feel like there were a lot of really interesting, powerful elements in here, and Amako as a character is so sort of like charming and interesting, and sometimes she does things and you can see how they hurt and frustrate the people around her, but you also understand her so much, and I just thought it was really well done. And then another Japanese book I read this month was The Kamagama Food Detectives by Hisashi Kashiwa. This is one of those kind of like novels told in stories, so there are 6 sort of chapters, stories in this book, and in each story we follow a person as they arrive at the Kawagama diner and are greeted by a father and daughter who use their detective powers to recreate a dish from the character's past. I really enjoyed this. It's fun and comforting. Some stories are really moving, and the descriptions of food are really, really fun. I will say that it is quite repetitive, like each story has exactly the same structure, and so by the end I think that is a little bit wearing. I feel like I could have done with a bit more development of the recurring characters. I was thinking about this book in relation to other Japanese novels with a similar structure, things like What You Are Looking For Is at the Library and Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and I feel like What You Are Looking For at the Library was a really fantastic example of this kind of structure of book where each story felt very different. There was a really different narrative voice, and we got to know more about the librarian like a little bit at a time through all of the stories, and I kind of love that, and I feel like that element, that through line, was missing in this book, so I did really enjoy it. But I feel like if you were looking for this kind of novel, then I feel like What You Were Looking For Is at the Library is the best example of that structure, if that makes sense. Then I also read Beach Read by Emily Henry in November, which was just such a joy. I love Emily Henry so much. I think she is such a wonderful, wonderful writer. I've read 4 of her books now. I just think they're all amazing. And I think she writes the kind of wonderful romance novels that just have like the exact right balance between the love story and everything else that's going on. Beach Read is about a young woman called January who is a romance novelist, and she is suffering from writer's block that has been largely brought about due to a lot of big changes in her life. After her father's death, she discovered something about him that made her reevaluate their whole family life. Then her long-term partner and her split up. She's running out of money. Everything is falling apart. But for various reasons, she has access to a beach house. So she goes to this new town, moves into this new house, tries to write her novel, and soon discovers that living in the house next door is her old college writing rival. He's a successful literary novelist who was also kind of struggling with his project, and so they agree to swap genres. He'll try and write a romance, she'll try and write literary fiction, and they will teach each other how their own genres work, and everything kind of goes on from there. I just love Beach Read so much. I thought it was so well done and so powerful, with such great characterization and such lovely moving moments. It is in many ways a book about grief, and there is a lot about January grieving for her father, and I feel like all of that stuff was done so well. There's also a surprising amount in this book about cults. The literary fiction novel that Gus is working on is about cults. And so January and Gus spend quite a lot of time visiting people who used to be in cults and talking to them about their experiences, which is a surprising element of the novel that I feel like I hadn't heard anyone talk about, that I feel like was really interesting. As I said, I just feel like Emily Henry gets the balance right between the love story and everything else going on, and I thought Beach Read was wonderful. Then I also read a thriller this month, Then Things Went Dark by B. Fitzgerald, which was fantastic. This was so compelling and addictive, and one of those books that is just like absolutely unputdownable. I know people say that about lots of books, but I feel like that was very true about this book. So this book is a thriller set on a reality TV show. 6 people are put together on an island for 4 weeks, and we know that by the end of the 4 weeks, one of them, Reese, will be dead. But what we don't know is whether his death was an accident or murder, and if it was murder, which one of the others killed him. And we have a little bit of the police in the present trying to piece together what happened, but we're mostly following the characters on the reality TV show episode by episode as everything descends into chaos. And it's just really, really fantastic, so gripping, so pacey, so well done. I love the format and the structure of it and the way kind of different like elements of the TV show were used. I will say that this is not a book to read if you're someone who doesn't like unlikable characters, because everyone is kind of awful, and there are moments where you feel sorry for quite a lot of the different characters, but this is a group of 6 exceptionally flawed, toxic people, and I feel like that is just done so well. So I really, really recommend this. Thought it was fantastic. Such a wonderful book. This month's historical fiction book club over on my Patreon was Midnight at Malabar House by Vaseem Khan, which was fantastic. This was another real favourite of the month, and everyone in the book club really loved it, which is always exciting when that happens. I just thought this was so well done. So this is a historical murder mystery set in 1949, 1950 in India, so a few years after partition, and the kind of shadow of partition really hangs over this story and is quite kind of pivotal to the mystery. We're following a woman called Persis, who is the first female police detective in India. She and her colleagues at Malabar House are all kind of like the misfits of the police force who have been put in one building away from everyone else, and she is brought in to investigate the death of an English diplomat. I just thought this book was so well done. I loved Persis as a character. She's so believable and realistic, and you can see when she's frustrated, but you also see her stubbornness and her determination to get to the truth in a way that I just thought was really well done. And this is the start of a series, and I'm really looking forward to carrying on and seeing more of her. And I'm also looking forward to seeing more of her dynamic with an Englishman called Blackfinch, who kind of also gets involved in the case, and he is very, very enjoyable to read about. I think what I loved most about this book is the way that the kind of murder mystery elements and the history were so sort of completely woven in together. You know, this isn't just a murder mystery that is set in the past. This is a murder mystery that is really about history, and about a particular historical event and the kind of shadows of it, and about trauma, both kind of on an individual level and a grand level, and I just thought that was fantastically done. So really recommend Midnight in Malabar House. Really looking forward to reading more by Vaseem Khan and reading on with the series. I just thought this was fantastic. Then I also read some poetry in November. I haven't read any poetry for ages, but I read 2 collections in November, both of which I really enjoyed. So I read Serious Concerns by Wendy Cope. This is a book from 1992, though Wendy Cope is still writing, I believe, and this was just such a joy. There are so many hilarious, fun poems in here. I read this as part of a reading vlog, and when I was editing that reading vlog, I just like could see myself just like laughing all the time, every poem nearly, which was really fun. There are a few more serious poems in here, but there are a lot of silly poems, which I just really enjoyed. And then I also read Bright Fear by Mary Jean Chan, which was fantastic. I feel like this is one of my favorite poetry collections I've ever read. Like, I just thought it was amazing. And I feel like usually when I read a poetry collection, even if I like it a lot, there's always a few poems that I don't really get anything out of, but I just feel like I got something out of every poem in this book. And I feel like the way Mary Jean Chan uses a kind of mixture of traditional poetry and prose poetry, I just thought that worked really well. And the narrative voice and the themes they explore are just fantastic. There's quite a lot about place and belonging. There's quite a lot about family and identity. I would also say that this is quite accessible too. Like, if you're not someone that reads a lot of poetry, I feel like Mary Jean Chan is quite approachable, and the poems in Bright Fear are really kind of understandable and you'll get something out of them. And I just thought it was amazing. Such a wonderful, incredible collection. Then finally, I read 4 non-fiction books in November. So I did participate in non-fiction November. Don't know that I managed to tick off many of the prompts, and I didn't read as much non-fiction as I wanted to, but I did read a few things. So one thing that I read was Novelist as a Vocation by Haruki Murakami, translated from the Japanese by Philip Gabriel and Ted Goosen. So this is a collection of essays by Haruki Murakami about being a novelist, being a writer, and I found this really interesting. I would say that this is probably a book to read if you are either a writer or a big fan of Murakami. I'm a writer. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Murakami. I really liked Norwegian Wood, and then I feel like every book I read after that, he kind of went down a bit in my estimation. Books like Kafka on the Shore are just too weird for me, and I do in general find his depiction of women to be not great. But I'd had this on my shelf for ages, so I wanted to pick it up, and I did find it really interesting. I think especially some of the things he says about like the literary scene in Japan, about translation, about kind of moving from being a very successful writer in Japan to being a sort of globally successful writer, and kind of what a difference that made. I thought those things were really interesting. There's kind of a real mix of like self-deprecating stuff and egotistical stuff, which I found kind of fascinating. So yeah, found it really interesting read. Like I said, maybe will be interesting to you if you're a writer or a big Murakami fan, but otherwise probably not a kind of wide recommendation, I suppose. And then I also read on audiobook The Anglo-Saxons, A History of the Beginnings of England by Mark Morris. This is a really interesting history book about the Anglo-Saxons. So basically, Mark Morris takes various figures from Anglo-Saxon history and uses them to tell the story of the Anglo-Saxon period. So it is kind of chronological linear history, but he kind of chooses to focus on one figure at a time to make it a bit more approachable, which I did think was quite effective. The figures are mostly kings and bishops because those are the people that we know most about from the Anglo-Saxon period. In general, I would recommend the Anglo-Saxons. I thought it was a good, interesting history if you're interested in the Anglo-Saxon period. And I do think the kind of like political and religious history that we have in here is really, really interesting. There's a lot in here about the history of early Christianity and the church, and how kind of the church and the monarchy impacted each other. So that stuff I thought was really interesting. And in general, if you're interested in learning a bit more about the Anglo-Saxon period, then I think it's a really good book to read. Then I also finally finished reading this. This is Asians in Britain, 400 Years of History by Rosina Visram. I've been reading this for ages and ages, for about 6 months, but I finally finished reading it in November. Basically, I was reading this like partly for historical fiction research. So I got through the sort of 18th and 19th century chapters ages ago. I think you can probably tell like where the 19th century ends when the tabs kind of thin out a bit. But basically I got to the end of the sort of First World War section, and then I put it down for ages. But I did want to finish it this year and read on with the rest of it because it was a really interesting book. So I picked it up and read the sort of 20th century sections in November. So this book spans sort of from the early 17th century to the mid 20th century and looks at the presence of people from South Asia, from the Indian subcontinent in Britain, who moved to Britain when, and what the lives were like for these people living in Britain over the course of the sort of 17th to 20th centuries. The 18th and 19th century sections take up quite a big chunk in this book, and the 19th century sections were fascinating. I mean, all of it was fascinating, but obviously like my historical interests are quite like focused in the 19th century, and the 19th century chapters in this were amazing. This book should probably be called South Asians in Britain, not just Asians in Britain, because it's very much about people from the Indian subcontinent. I think if you picked up this book hoping to find out more about the lives of people from different bits of Asia in Britain throughout the last 400 years, I feel like you would be a bit disappointed. But if you're interested in the history of people from the Indian subcontinent in Britain, then this is fantastic. This is such a fascinating book in terms of social and economic history, in terms of the history of immigration, the history of culture, the history of prejudice. Like there's so much in here that is fascinating. But I think like one of the most fascinating things in this book is just there are so many individuals that Rosina Visram talks about, and so many individual fascinating lives that you learn about through this book. And I've learned about so many just really, really fascinating individuals from history that I now want to go and find out more about, or have gone and found out more about. You know, back in July, I read The Travels of Dean Mahomet, an 18th century journey through India, which is a book written by an Indian man who moved to Ireland and later to England. He settled in England, married, had children, his descendants lived in England, and I found out about him through this book, and then I went and read his book that he had written, which was the first book published by an Indian person in English, and was fascinating. And there are so many other really interesting individuals I found out about through this book. George Adelgee, who was born in Britain to Parsi parents, who was wrongly accused of murdering cattle, and in the plight to clear his name, ended up meeting Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who ended up fighting for his defence. Did you know that the first South Asian MP to sit in Parliament in the UK was David Octagy Dice Somber in 1841? Did you know that the first woman to study law in a British university was an Indian woman named Cornelia Sabaji? There were so many fascinating stories of just individual really interesting people in this book, and there's a lot in this book about social trends and overarching narratives, but I just feel like the individual glimpses into people's lives you get in this book were just amazing. So I really recommend this. It is definitely on the more academic side. I think this book has similarities in aims to something like David Olusoga's Black and British, but I think it's a much less accessible book. But I do think it's really fantastic. And if you're interested in this topic, then I do think it's a really interesting read. As someone who studied history at university, this is one of those books where reading this book, I just remember all the reasons why I love studying and learning about history. So yeah, really recommend this. Fantastic book. Then finally, another book I listened to on audiobook was Empire Land: How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain by Sathnam Sanghera. This was a really fantastic book, really interesting read. I feel like the subtitle tells you quite a lot about the book. Sathnam Sanghera is a journalist, and basically Empire Land is kind of a mixture of history, journalism, social commentary, and a little bit of memoir, in which he talks both about the history of the British Empire and also kind of the long legacy of the British Empire and how it has shaped a lot of things about Britain today. And he also talks about his own kind of journey coming to know more about the history of the British Empire and how he felt about the things that he learnt along the way. He talks about how the British Empire shaped and continues to shape education, especially in fee-paying schools. He talks about how sort of museum culture and the culture of going to museums and of having museums is so rooted in imperialism and the practice of looting. He talks about how British xenophobia and racism in the present day is so shaped by the legacy of empire. I would really recommend Empire Land. I thought it was fantastic, and it's a very accessible, approachable book. The audiobook is great as well. It's not read by Sathnam Sanghera, but the narrator who reads it is fantastic. I think you can tell when the reader is reading it, when he has come to a fact that he is really shocked and horrified by, because he sounds so angry. And I think that's really important because it is a book that will make you angry, or should make you angry, and the fact that when you're listening to it, you can tell how angry the audiobook narrator is too, and how horrified he is by some of the things he's talking about. I feel like that makes the audiobook experience even better. I would say it was also a really good book to read at the same time or alongside Asians in Britain. And actually there were quite a few historical figures that Sathnam Sanghera would mention, and I'd be like, oh yes, I've heard of them, I know about them from Asians in Britain. I would say that Empire Land is definitely the much more accessible book, and this is much more of an academic book, but they were really interesting to kind of read side by side, and I feel like I learned a lot from both of them, both separately and jointly, if that makes sense. So that's what I read in November. Lots and lots of books. Hopefully this video hasn't been too long, but I read some really great, interesting things in November. Do let me know down in the comments, what did you read in November? What was your highlight of the month? Did you take part in non-fiction November, and what did you read? And otherwise, that's all. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.